It's kind of funny, right? Jacques Derrida, like a huge figure in 20th century philosophy, someone who like really sparked a lot of discussion. Well, he once said he didn't know how to tell a story. And get this.
Mhm.
He said this while writing a biographical study of a friend that contained absolutely no personal memories.
Yeah, that's fascinating, for sure.
Right? I mean, it's like,
And this little story already gives us a taste of what we're going to explore today,
yeah,
like the life and some of the main ideas of Jacques Derrida based on all this material you've given us. A thinker who, for many folks, can still seem, well, kind of complicated to grasp, to be
yeah,
honest.
exactly. So if you've heard of Derrida before and kind of felt a little intimidated, like you wouldn't understand anything, well, you can relax.
Definitely.
Our mission today is to take some of those key concepts, those big ideas, and make things clear, pulling out the most fascinating and thought-provoking nuggets from, all this Derrida stuff. We want to understand some of the challenges he posed to traditional ways of thinking about, language, truth, and knowledge. And from what we've seen, we have a pretty complete overview of his life and work to guide us in this deep dive.
Absolutely. And to begin to unravel this Derridian universe, maybe it would be interesting to look a bit at his background, the context in which he was born and raised, which certainly had a huge influence on his thought.
Definitely. He was born in Algeria in 1930. And a crucial point is that he came from a Sephardic Jewish family living within the context of French colonialism. I mean, he was both part of the dominant culture and, in a way, a foreigner within it. This double identity already seems like a significant starting point to me.
Absolutely. And this feeling of being both inside and outside was dramatically intensified with World War II. Algeria, although not a direct battlefield, felt the effects of the Nazi occupation of France. In 1942, racial laws were introduced, exposing an underlying anti-Semitism in the European population of Algeria.
It's shocking to think that at only 12 years old, Derrida was told by a teacher that French culture was not made for little Jews. He was the top student, lost the privilege of raising the French flag at school, and was later expelled due to, a racial quota system. Imagine the impact of this on a young intellectual's development.
A profound impact, no doubt. And it's understandable that later on he was reluctant to establish a direct causal link between these experiences and his mature thought. After all, as we know, his stated intention was to question philosophy, not himself. But it's impossible to ignore how these experiences of exclusion and marginalization may have shaped his critical view of power structures and fixed categories of identity.
No doubt. It's also interesting to note that before dedicating himself to philosophy, he had a huge interest in football, even dreaming of becoming a professional player. And get this, he admired Albert Camus, who also played football, and was both a thinker and a man of action. It seems like this figure of an engaged intellectual appealed to him.
Yes, this connection with Camus is revealing. But Derrida's intellectual journey led him down different paths. He moved to Paris to prepare for the École Normale Supérieure, and initially he was drawn to Sartre's existentialist philosophy, with that central idea that existence precedes essence.
That notion that we build our own subjectivity through our choices and actions without any, predefined human nature.
Right.
But he didn't stay in that line for long, did he?
No, he delved deeper into the studies of Husserl and Heidegger, who were key figures in the development of phenomenology, this philosophy of consciousness that emphasizes intuition as the basis of knowledge, something that resides beyond rational or scientific proof.
So the idea was that the truth about the fundamental questions of life and existence could only be accessed through this intuitive experience, this immediate awareness.
Exactly. Think of it as a form of direct knowledge, an immediate understanding that doesn't need logic or evidence to be felt as true. And this emphasis on intuition as the foundation of knowledge would be one of the central points that Derrida would question later, as we'll see.
Gotcha.
But before we get there, it's worth mentioning his experience during the Algerian War. He supported independence, but was devastated by the violence on both sides and by the mass exodus of Europeans after independence, feeling a strong nostalgia, a nostalgia for an Algeria that no longer existed.
A turbulent period that, in a way, coincided with the beginning of his own independence as a philosopher in 1962 with the publication of his introduction to the translation of Husserl's The Origin of Geometry. And this introduction was practically a book in itself, almost overshadowing Husserl's own work.
Yes, it is in this text that Derrida begins to formulate some of his most important critiques. Husserl, as a mathematician by origin, was concerned with the potential relativism of phenomenology in basing all knowledge on individual intuition. If knowledge resides beyond reason and science, how to guarantee a universal truth?
He saw geometry as a perfect form of knowledge, something that existed in a timeless realm of truth, immune to the variations of human intuition, right?
Precisely. Husserl argued that geometry, although having a historical origin in a primordial intuition, think of the first mathematician having an insight about shapes and relationships once its basic concepts were established, its logical structure revealed itself as something that was already there, waiting to be discovered. This would guarantee the truth of geometry and, by extension, of all scientific and mathematical knowledge.
But Derrida saw a crucial flaw in this argument, an aporia, an internal inconsistency. How could geometry be both rooted in a historical subjective intuition and at the same time exist in a timeless realm of truth, already there? It's as if the foundation is both a point in time and something that has always existed.
Exactly. For Derrida, this contradiction undermined the very basis of philosophy and the possibility of consistent knowledge. It wasn't just a debate about geometry, but a questioning of philosophy's ability to operate on its own terms, of the foundations of all our knowledge. Either our knowledge is based on intuition or it isn't, but there can't be this contradictory coexistence. And Derrida was interested in exploring these aporias, these logical dead ends he found in the foundations of Western thought.
And this critique of the notion of absolute truth, guaranteed by a transcendental presence, as Heidegger had also pointed out, is a common thread running through all of Derrida's thought, isn't it? That idea that the very philosophical notion of truth based on intuition ends up contradicting itself because only an absolute domain could guarantee absolute truth, something that a finite intellect cannot intuit.
Exactly. And as Derrida points out, it's not hard to see the shadow of the divine behind this claim of a presence that would guarantee absolute truth. For centuries, God fulfilled this role, but without this presence, be it divine or absolute, truth becomes slippery and we fall into relativism.
Which brings us to another central point in Derrida's thought, the famous statement that there is nothing outside the text, a phrase that, at first glance, might seem enigmatic.
Without a doubt. And it's important to understand that this text for Derrida is not limited to books or written words. He refers to any type of science system, to any structure of signification through which we perceive and interpret the world. Think of a movie, a painting, a dress code, even the rules of a game. These are all texts in the Derridian sense because they carry meanings and are interpreted.
So when he wrote that biographical study on Polderman without any personal memories, focusing only on the interpretation of his friend's intellectual work, it fits into this idea, right? The incorporation of memory inevitably imposes an interpretation, blurring the pure legibility. It's as if memory is another text superimposed on the original text of the work.
Perfectly. For Derrida, any attempt to fix a definitive meaning, to go beyond the text, to find an essential truth, is always problematic because this search inevitably involves interpretation and, therefore, a form of textuality. For those of you listening, thinking about the materials he sent us, Derrida would suggest that even your choice of these materials, the way you initially understood the topic, are already part of the text that influences our understanding. There is no neutral and objective viewpoint outside of these initial choices.
And this view directly impacts how he understands language, doesn't it? He argues that language, with its inherent presuppositions and structures, inevitably distorts thought. Even Descartes' famous cogito ergo sum doesn't escape this criticism.
Exactly. Derrida argues that Descartes, in seeking a fundamental certainty through reason expressed in language, I think, therefore I am, remained trapped within the very limitations of the language he used. It was impossible to step outside of language to find an absolute certainty because the very structure and dynamics of language can lead to error. Descartes' statement presupposes the meaning of think and am, which are already linguistic constructions.
And Hume, with his critique of the notion of identity and causality, in a way corroborates this view that language can lead us to conclusions that don't hold up under a more rigorous analysis of experience, right? That idea that we are only aware of the coexistence of thinking and being without an intrinsic notion of a continuous self or a necessary cause between them.
Precisely. And this instability of language is reinforced by the idea of undecidability, a central concept in Derrida's thought that challenges the very logical law of the excluded middle, the one that tells us that a proposition is either true or false with no middle ground. Think of it as situations where we can't clearly decide between two options, where both seem to have validity.
And he uses interesting examples to illustrate this, like the paradoxical phrase, "this sentence is a lie," which cannot be consistently true or false, or poetic language, which often transgresses this binary logic, like Shakespeare's verses comparing the world to a stage.
Exactly. Poetic language operates on multiple levels of meaning, challenging fixed categories and binary oppositions. And Derrida goes further, arguing that traditional philosophy erred in seeking an essential truth in the essences of things, instead of focusing on the very language we use to describe and conceptualize those things.
Because for him, language does not have an essential equivalence with the objects or concepts it names. Meaning emerges from a system of differences, from the multiple and subtle distinctions between words, and not from fixed identities. It's as if the meaning of white only exists in opposition to black, blue, red, and so on.
Exactly. And Western thought, especially philosophy, has relied on these binary oppositions implicit in logic. True, false, mind, body, male, female, and so on. But the problem, as Derrida points out, is that the meaning of one term often depends on the meaning of the other, creating a circularity. And behind this, there is a hidden metaphysical presupposition that reality itself possesses a logical coherence.
So we project onto reality this binary logical structure that we find in language without being sure that reality itself operates that way.
Exactly. And consciousness, our intuition of the world, operates beyond this logic. It does not intuit a presence of absolute truth. We know the world through consciousness and this mirror of language, which are the foundations of our knowledge, but which paradoxically are excluded from the formal process of obtaining knowledge through logic and reason.
Which leads to the idea that our knowledge of the world based on identity, logic, and truth paradoxically originates from an aporia, from an internal contradiction. And it's interesting to note that this critique of logic, although directed at Western thought, also seems to turn against Derrida's own argument, which is expressed through language and logic.
Yes, this is a criticism that is often raised, but Derrida does not shy away from this self-criticism. He acknowledges this tension and seeks to explore the implications of this inevitable contradiction. And as we have seen, this is not entirely new. Thinkers like Berkeley and Hume had already pointed out inconsistencies in mathematics and in our notions of causality and identity, using logic itself to do so. And Gödel, with his incompleteness theorems, showed that mathematics could never be a fully accurate and self-contained system.
So the big question is, what does Derrida really add to these arguments? He seems to go further by questioning the very process of logic, but still using logical argumentation to do so.
It's a pertinent question. Derrida would argue that intuition and reason operate in distinct domains, and that the application of one to the other does not produce the desired certainty. But, in fact, what is essentially new in Derrida's contribution is debatable. What is fascinating here is the radicality with which he takes these criticisms to their ultimate consequences, questioning notions that we often take for granted.
But despite these criticisms, Derrida's thought had a significant impact, especially in literary criticism, with the emergence of deconstructionism. This idea of dismantling the implicit assumptions within a text, revealing multiple layers of meaning instead of a single authoritative interpretation.
Exactly. Initially in the United States, deconstructionism was seen as a powerful tool for revealing new interpretations and subtexts in literary works, exposing hidden intentions and implicit ambiguities. Imagine a literary critic using deconstruction to show how a seemingly conservative novel might contain subversive elements. But the reception in the philosophical community was colder, with questions about the relevance of this approach to the clarity of philosophical argumentation. And scientists in general considered all of this to be unimportant nonsense.
Meaning that each field, within its own conventions and presuppositions, had a different reaction to Derrida's thought. And he himself called this dismantling process deconstruction, a term that quickly became fashionable in some academic circles, generating both enthusiasm and rejection.
Yes, deconstructionism became a watershed moment in academia, with fervent supporters and equally passionate critics. And it's interesting to note how this debate was reflected in different disciplines, with philosophy and literary criticism being more receptive than the sciences.
And in the midst of this intellectual whirlwind, there were also the events of May 1968 in Paris, in which Derrida took an active part. The student demonstrations that shook France and exposed the rigidity of the education system and the sterility of French society.
Exactly. In this context, Derrida's insistence on the fluidity of language and difference takes on a new layer of meaning. Difference, just to make it clear, is not just difference. The letter A in the middle is crucial. It implies both to differ, to be distinct, and to defer in the sense of to postpone or to delay meaning. So meaning is not fixed. It is always in the process of becoming, always dependent on other words and their absent presence. It was a critique of the linguistic orthodoxy represented by the Académie Française, which sought to fix and purify the French language, which for many felt like a form of intellectual oppression.
And this struggle for freedom of thought and expression, this critique of rigid structures, perhaps explains Derrida's initial sympathy for Foucault's cultural relativism, which saw all knowledge as textual and dependent on power structures, the epistemes that shape the thought of each era.
Yes, both were seen as central figures of post-structuralism, but there was a major point of divergence in the interpretation of Descartes. Derrida argued that Foucault, in analyzing Descartes using the language of reason, remained within the very episteme of the age of reason that he was trying to analyze. For Derrida, Descartes' text was open to even more radical interpretations.
So it was impossible for Foucault, as it was for Descartes, to use a language that placed itself outside of the very language it was describing. And this criticism created some tension between the two thinkers, with Foucault seeing Derrida's analysis as a mere intellectual game.
Exactly. While Foucault emphasized the analysis of the power structures inherent in historical texts, insisting on the possibility of a specific interpretation within a given epistemic context, Derrida stressed the multiplicity of possible interpretations for any text, which left him vulnerable to the accusation of extreme relativism.
But his relationship with Roland Barthes, another influential Parisian intellectual, seems to have been less conflictual, though also nuanced. Barthes, with his semiology, focused on the second-order meaning of texts, on the analysis of the interconnected symbols and signs that underpin the surface. And he went so far as to announce the famous death of the author.
Yes, for Barthes, the author's intention was irrelevant. The true meaning resided in the structure of signs and in the analysis of how these signs operate within a given cultural system.
Right.
And Derrida had ambivalent feelings about this idea. On the one hand, he applauded the exposure of the hidden presuppositions behind the universal truths of bourgeois values.
But on the other hand, he questioned the possibility of any critique, completely escaping the humanistic presuppositions that were being criticized. The very language used in this critique would inevitably contain traces of these presuppositions, creating a kind of circularity.
Exactly. For Derrida, we were always limited by the circularity of our discourse, trapped in this inevitable humanistic dimension, which can be seen as limiting in relation to any notion of absolute truth beyond social construction, but also encouraging in recognizing that truth as we know it is always from the human for the human.
And in the scenario of intense intellectual production and heated debates, Derrida continued to develop his ideas, as we see in later works such as La Dissemination and Glass. In La Dissemination, he reinforces the idea that there can never be a single fixed meaning for a text, due to the force of ambiguities, wordplay, and multiple associations. And he himself declared the final essay of this work as indecipherable and illegible.
Yes. In La Dissemination, Derrida radicalizes this notion of the fluidity of meaning, exploring the multiple resonances of words and the impossibility of fixing an ultimate meaning. And with Glass, he takes this formal experimentation to the extreme, with those two juxtaposed columns, one with a reading of Hegel and the other with comments on the work of Jean Genet, challenging traditional notions of what a book should be, and exploring the contrast between German metaphysics and French transgression. The very form of the book, with its columns that do not meet and its different fonts, is already a demonstration of deconstruction in action.
A visually striking work, with different types of fonts, indentations, and quotations, almost like a typographic happening that reflects the very deconstruction of meaning.
Right.
And then we had La Carte Postale de Socrates à Freud et au-delà, where he introduces the concept of the postal principle as more fundamental than Freud's pleasure principle, emphasizing the inevitable failure in communication, the possibility that a message may never reach its destination.
Exactly. And in this work, he also develops a critique of Freudian psychoanalysis, paradoxically accusing it of metaphysics, despite Freud's attempt to establish psychoanalysis as an empirical science. For Derrida, any search for truth inevitably invokes this presence that haunts Western thought. He argues that even the Freudian notion of the unconscious as a psychic trace presupposes a kind of originating presence that deconstruction questions.
But in the midst of this complexity, there are also interesting insights, such as the distinction between reality, which is neither true nor false, and discourse, which operates in the register of truth and falsehood. Discourse describes our encounter with reality, but not reality itself.
Precisely. And it is along these lines that we can understand Derrida's involvement in political and social issues. He always saw deconstruction as a tool against authoritarianism and injustice, even if the politics of deconstruction did not translate into an explicit manifesto. For him, deconstructing certainties and fixed categories was a way of opening space for difference and justice.
He actively participated in the campaign for the release of Nelson Mandela and against apartheid in South Africa, and also fought for the right to citizenship for immigrants in France, showing a surprising clarity in his political arguments, contrasting with the complexity of his philosophy.
Yes. On these issues, Derrida demonstrated a direct engagement and a clear defense of ethical and political principles. On the other hand, his position on feminism was more complex, emphasizing difference rather than equality, and criticizing what he called reactive feminism. He saw the risk of feminism simply inverting traditional binary oppositions, such as male-female, without really questioning the very structure of these oppositions.
A view that generated debates and different interpretations within the feminist movement itself. And at the end of his career, he found himself at the center of a controversy when Cambridge University offered him an honorary doctorate, with some faculty members vehemently opposed, criticizing French philosophy as lacking rigor and clarity.
Despite this resistance, the honorary degree was awarded, demonstrating recognition of his stature as a thinker, even amidst the controversy. And Derrida continued his deconstruction of great names in philosophy and literature, such as Freud, specters of Marx and the idea of hauntology, the specter of the past that haunts the present, and Joyce, where he explores the multiplicity of possible interpretations, almost without limits, applying his methods to reveal new layers of meaning and question traditional interpretations.
And in his analysis of Joyce, for example, he questions whether there would be a limit to the interpretations of the Irish writer's work, recognizing the richness and multiplicity of meanings present in his language, contrasting with his own approach more focused on destabilizing meaning. It is interesting to think how the same word, such as quark in Joyce and in Murray Gell-Mann's physics, can have such distinct uses, one open to literary interpretation and the other seeking scientific precision.
Exactly. The parable of the word quark, used both by Joyce in literature and by Gell-Mann in physics to name a subatomic particle, well illustrates this distinction between the literary use of language, open to multiple interpretations, and the scientific use, which seeks a precise and functional definition.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the universe of Jacques Derrida. We've explored his journey, his influences, some of his key concepts like aporia, deconstruction, undecidability, and the idea that there is nothing outside the text, as well as his involvement in political issues and the controversies that surrounded his work.
Yes. We've seen how Derrida challenged traditional notions of truth and knowledge, deconstructed binary oppositions, emphasized the ambiguity and fluidity of language, and showed us that meaning is never fixed or fully present.
Right.
We hope that our conversation has offered a more accessible entry point to these complex ideas.
And for those of you who joined us on this journey, here's a final thought. Considering Derrida's perspective, how can we approach understanding complex information or differing viewpoints, knowing that a single absolute truth might be illusory? Could acknowledging the inherent ambiguities in communication change how we interpret the world around us?
A thought-provoking question that invites us to think beyond easy certainties. And if this discussion has intrigued you, we invite you to further explore the work of Derrida and the thinkers who influenced him, such as Husserl and Heidegger, or even the literary authors with whom he engaged.
That's all for today. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive. Until next time.
See ya.
Guys, see you in another podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.